So before we get into some of the specific strategies, we wanted to take some time at the beginning of our session today to kind of talk through some important considerations that can sometimes be a little bit confusing when we think of ourselves as instructors or teaching assistants. And one of those things is really thinking about what is our role when it comes to supporting our students. What are our responsibilities? What is our role? What should we be doing? I think that's a question that a lot of us have been asking ourselves potentially over our entire career of working with students, but certainly in this last year where we've seen an increase in the number of students disclosing really challenging things to us that they're going through, and also an intensity of what students are facing and what they're sharing with us. And so we want to be really clear from the outset about what our role as instructors and as teaching assistants includes. And maybe we'll start with thinking about what our role does not include. So it's really important for us to know, and this is part of boundary setting, that we are not licensed therapists or clinicians, right? So our role is not to provide therapeutic services or to give medical advice. And so in situations where we think a student, based on our interactions, is in need of some professional assistance, whether that be mental health or medical services, in those cases, there are campus offices that are made for that, right? And have professionals who are able to provide those types of services. And so there's a list here of some of those campus services. We'll provide you with a list, also a kind of a more thorough list of campus resources that are available to students in distress. And so that's kind of an important starting place to really recognize that as instructors, we're really not in a position to assume responsibility for our students' well-being or take on roles like, therapist or medical professional. Now, that being said, that does not mean that we do not have responsibilities in regards to supporting our students, including supporting them emotionally, right? That's part of learning, and our role as instructors is to support our students in learning. And the emotional lives of our students is going to play a role in their learning in our courses. And so what our role does include, first, being accessible and transparent. And so, really letting students know that you are available, making sure that there's time set aside for students to meet with you, being transparent about course policies. And one thing that I wanted to raise here is, really intentionally signaling to your students that you do care about what's going on in their lives emotionally, that is relevant to their experience in the class. And that's something that you invite and want to be hearing from them, is what they need in order to be successful in your class. So that's one thing. And then, once students do come to us and share with us some of the things that they're going through and difficulties that they're facing, what we can do then is, one thing is listen to our students, right? And that's what we're going to focus on in our workshop today primarily is, strategies for really helping our students feel supported and heard and validated when they come to us to share with us what's going on in their lives and how that's affecting their learning in our classes. So that'll be the primary focus, but also, of course, providing appropriate accommodations within the class, especially if you're the course instructor and you're in a position to make adjustments, change deadlines, things that you can do to provide reasonable and appropriate accommodations to help your student, be successful in your course, even if they're facing difficulties in their life outside of the course. And certainly connecting students with resources as needed. And that's something that, we'll talk about a little bit later, but also provide you with some pretty thorough resources about what's available for students on campus. So that's kind of one thing that I want to just mention right from the start, that what we're going to be talking about today is really about our role as instructors and how we can be supporting our students in order to continue and promote their learning in our courses, again, even as we are dealing with some very difficult circumstances. All right, and one other thing that I wanted to kind of mention before we dive into the strategies, just to kind of contextualize what we're talking about, is, I think something that's been maybe come up new for a lot of us in this last year is, again, this kind of heightened emotional intensity of the work that we're doing with our students and what we're hearing from our students. And so it's important to recognize the potential really occupational hazards that can accompany work that involves caring for others. And so this is something that's referred to as the cost of caring. And I just wanted to share these with you, again, because it's really important, I think, to be aware of some of these possible effects, possible impacts of the work, and also to identify them as occupational hazards, right? Things that it's really important for us to build a toolkit around so that, we can continue to sustain ourselves. And so one of those things is burnout, right? This might be something that many of us have felt. So burnout is just a sense of exhaustion within your job, within your role, right? It's also possible that as a result of this type of work that involves, providing emotional support, that we might start feeling something that's known as compassion fatigue, which is kind of similar to burnout, but a little bit different in that it's kind of more expansive, not just within your job, but can branch out into other areas of your life. So this might feel like just a complete sense of exhaustion, feeling like you have nothing left to give, maybe avoiding social interactions, not only in the workplace, but even with, folks that you live with, your family, your friends, just from the sense of kind of deep fatigue with showing up emotionally. And then another thing that we need to be aware of is the possibility of secondary trauma and vicarious traumatization, which is kind of the cumulative result of bearing witness to and hearing about other people's lived traumatic experiences. And this can look like trauma responses, so avoidance of triggers, insomnia, things like that. And so I wanted to share these things, not to focus on the negative, but just to say, first of all, if in doing this work that you've been doing with students, if you've been feeling any of these things come up, that does not mean that you're doing a bad job. That does not mean that you're not good at this. It actually means the opposite. These are, as I said, occupational hazards that go with the work of caring deeply for your students. And also, if you've been feeling any of these things, you are not alone, right? And so because of this, again, we really want to make sure that we have a strong toolkit so that we can make sure that we are equipped, right, to do this type of work and maintain our own well-being. And I wanted to throw out there just a couple of resources. There's a self-test, the Professional Quality of Life self-test that's available online. We will send these slides out, by the way, so don't feel like you need to write any of this down right now. But that's a self-test that can help if you feel like you might be feeling some of those things. It can help to identify current levels of each of those things, which, could be useful in just informing yourself. And then also, of course, let you know that there is support available to you as well. So we're talking about supporting our students, but there is support available to students through CAPS. And, if you are a graduate student or a student, that means that support is available. And faculty and staff, we have support available through FSAP. So I wanted to make sure that you know that, and that, encourage you if you feel like you need assistance or help working through any of these things, you are not alone and support is available. All right, finally, the last thing I wanted to mention before we dive in is just to acknowledge that today's workshop might refer to topics that are personally triggering to you or, feel emotionally charged for you. And so we want to raise that at the beginning and just let you know throughout our time together, don't engage any more than you feel comfortable, right? However you show up in this space today is totally wonderful. So if you're noticing that you want to step back, that's totally fine. Absolutely whatever you need to do to feel comfortable and feel safe in our work together today. And another thing that we wanted to just encourage you as you're here today is to pay attention to your body's response. Our conversation today might be an opportunity for you to either begin or continue in the process of identifying your own triggers, right? What are the things that cause you distress? And that can be a really great thing to identify in advance, because if and when those things come up with students, if you know ahead of time what those triggers are, you can have a plan for those moments so that you're not dealing with both your own emotional reaction and trying to make a plan for how to support the student all in one moment. All right, so with all of that being said, I think we are ready to dive into thinking about some of the tools and strategies that we can use to support our students when they come to us and share with us what they're going through. And so for that, I'm going to pass it on over to Rachel.
Thanks so much, Joey. So yeah, everything that Joey has talked about so far, burnout, compassion fatigue, emotionally charged topics, the potential for being triggered, and general exhaustion. I think it's safe to say that those are all things that are affecting us or might be affecting us and are affecting the students who we work with, either as instructors or advisors, etc. a few weeks ago, I was having a conversation with my sister, and I was telling her about this kind of constant state of anxiety, fear, and just like, I don't know, feeling ill at ease all the time that I'm living with. And she told me it's like waiting for the next shoe to drop, and that shoe is coming from a centipede. Just like kind of every day something else happens. And so before I dive into listening strategies, I wanted to just provide some really quick tips on how to make things a little bit easier all the way around. And so first thing is just remembering, acknowledging that we are living in a period of like extended fatigue and chronic stress. And in extended periods of fatigue and chronic stress, executive skills are the first things to go. So executive skills are things like staying organized, managing your to-do list, right? Feeling on top of stuff. And so if you're teaching a class, the more that you can create structure and predictability for your students, the better. So you can essentially just try to take the guesswork out of working with you as much as you can. So that might mean in your syllabus, you have a clear and preemptive COVID or crisis policy, right? Lay out for your students right up front what they should do if, for example, they test positive or, they get vaccinated and it takes them out for 3 days. Do they need to email you? Do they need to email their TA? Will they get extensions, etc., right? Just make it nice and clear. And then that can also benefit you because you're dealing with fewer panicked emails. Another thing that's impacted in chronic fatigue and stress is memory. So again, even though it does seem like it's spring, people are being vaccinated, that doesn't mean that we're not dealing with these forces. And so you can actually still expect, even a year on, that many students are going to be having trouble remembering things. And you might be feeling this way too. I know that I am. I have often described my brain as Swiss cheese. Things just seem to be falling out. And so you can actually anticipate that and try to accommodate for it a little bit in terms of writing things down, repeating yourself more times than you would ordinarily, and asking your students what kind of resources would help them. One thing that we've heard from students is that having the instructor take notes during the office hours so that they don't have to remember everything can be really helpful. And then finally, for your students, it is just astonishing that everyone is still functioning on Zoom, taking classes, teaching, learning right now. And students, because they've been doing it for so long, might not actually appreciate just how hard they're working and just how much of an accomplishment this is. And so I encourage you to consider reminding them about how much they've grown or how well they're doing under the circumstances. Because as you remind them, that's also a little treat for you because you're also helping them through this, emphasizing the good things for them, emphasizing the good things for yourself. So that's on one side. On the other side, as Joey mentioned, I really encourage you to plan now for the stressful situations that you might imagine occurring. And if that sounds really basic, this was something that no one ever told me. And so that's why I'm saying it. I really wish that I had come up with a plan when I was a TA with a course instructor to be like, if I'm sick, who do I get to cover my section? If I'm exhausted, like, what do you want me to do if I'm behind on my grading, right? You can plan now for days or weeks that things go wrong. You don't have to wait for those to happen and then scramble. And as you're thinking about that, think about who's on your team, who you can ask for help, and then also what you can offer to those people, right? How can you build up a network of support within your department, within your division, et cetera? And I'm going to talk about that more later, so you'll hear me say this several times. And then finally, I didn't put this on the slide, but I do want to emphasize that no matter how clear you are or how much guidance you give them, it's very likely that students are going to disregard your requests and do things that bother you. It happens and it can cause a lot of feelings. I know for me, when I put in all this effort up front and then a student just like completely disregards my instructions, I feel like they're dismissing all the hard work that I put in to make the class great. And it hurts and it's kind of annoying. And so I want to say that's a very reasonable response, right? And the line not to cross is assuming a student's intentions behind those actions. There's a real difference between thinking, oh, I really wish they didn't do this, and they don't care about the class or respect me. There are many, many reasons right now that students are acting the way that they are, and you don't need to actually find a reason to blame in order to feel your feelings and then move on. Okay, so those are some general tips, and now I'm going to move into one-on-one support of students. What can you do in your role? So number one, if a student comes to you with an issue, and right now I'm talking about people who are working with students in classes, although I think this is pretty easy to translate, like if you're in a staff or some kind of supervisory support role. So number one, if a student comes to you with a problem, you can accommodate them, right? That might mean granting them an extension, offering them some extra support. If you're an IA or a TA, it might mean having a conversation with the professor about the amount of work that they're assigning in the class. It might mean exploring asynchronous options, etc. And this is pretty clearly within the bounds of our jobs, right? This is what we're pretty much used to. I do want to point out here that you're allowed to balance accommodations with your own capacities. So you might decide you can keep track of assignment extensions, but you're not able to put together a whole remedial lecture. And that's totally okay. You can work within your boundaries while also accommodating students. Okay, number two, if your student is facing a material hardship or needs resources beyond what you can provide, you can ask them if they would be interested in hearing about a university resource that might help them. And if they are, then you can direct them to that resource. So I'm going to drop into chat, hopefully, a link to a document that we put together that's just kind of a short list of most of the resources that UCSD has to offer. I would hope that it's all, but I don't know for sure, so I'll just say most. And then finally, you can listen to your students. And I want to pause here and just think about a time that you felt really, really heard. When you were talking with someone and they did something that just made you feel like, ooh, they get it. I am seen, I am witnessed. That feels really good. And so that's one of the things that we can do for our students. And in fact, a survey of students in the spring, so from last April, which surveyed them about the impact of COVID on their mental health, students actually said the three most important things for school leaders to do in the short term and in the long term to support them were one, increased academic support, right? Accommodations, leniency. Two, more mental health resources. And then three, empathy, compassion, communication, understanding, and validations for the burdens that they're experiencing. Listening to students is one of the most important things you can do to help them through difficult times and keep their academic careers on track. So I want to be clear, like, this can very easily be within the bounds of our jobs. But how? I guess that's kind of the key question here. How can you be the listener that students want without taking on their hardships and without burning yourself out? Well, for one, it helps to recognize right away that being a good listener pretty much contradicts our usual role as educators, right? So usually we're experts, we're problem solvers, we feel completely responsible for our courses, content, responding to emails in a timely manner, getting students connected to resources, and more. And that's a really hard and stressful position to be in. And so it's something that we get trained for, and it's something that we practice, right? We recognize it's a skill set and we cultivate those skills. And because we get so good at this role, the expert problem solver role, we often want to translate that and those skills over to one-on-one support. But translating that level of responsibility to listening is not good. we can't be responsible for students' well-being in the way that we're responsible for managing our classrooms. Being a good listener is kind of the opposite of being an expert educator. First and foremost, you're not the expert, and you don't need to be the expert, right? Whoever you're listening to is the expert on what they're talking about. If your student is telling you about something that's going on, they're the expert, and you're collaborating with them, not trying to know it all. Second, right, we get really good at problem solving, but when students come to talk to us about what they're going through, they often know ahead of time that we can't fix their problems. And so if you jump in and you try to fix it and you feel responsible for fixing one of their problems, that actually does both of you a disservice. With the brief caveat that when a student is telling you about something in their life, they are giving you information about their ability to be a student. So you might have the opportunity to use that to accommodate them within the class. And if you're not sure, just ask. But because being a good listener is so different than our normal skills, it can actually start to feel like you're not doing anything when you're listening to a student because you're not taking action in the ways that you ordinarily would. And I want to tell you, you are. Listening and creating a space where a student feels heard and validated, that's an act of care. And it actually comes with whole philosophies and skill sets behind it. Right? So listening is a skill that you can cultivate, just like you've cultivated how to be an expert pedagogue. So here's a really short overview of some of the listening skills that you can develop. So I like to call this skill set engaged listening. So engaged listening is a set of techniques meant to help your student feel listened to without you taking on that student's emotions. Easier said than done, right? But I would encourage you to keep in mind that this is good for both of you. Because when you take on a student's emotions, you actually limit their ability to express themselves. But by staying open and minimizing your assumptions about and reactions to what they're going through, you both support them and protect yourself. And like I said, recognizing your own reactions as a listener is a skill that you can cultivate. So tip number one, don't assume you know how a student is feeling. Just ask them instead. For example, a student might tell you that their grandparent has died. They might feel sad about it, but they might also have really complicated feelings. Maybe they're stressed because on top of their own stuff, they now have to take on the work of cleaning out their grandparents' apartment. If you box them into sadness and assume that that's the way they're feeling, and then react as if they're feeling that way, they might not feel like they're able to fully express themselves, and they just, never lose that sense of frustration. And I'm sure that we can all think of times when this has happened, right? Where you try to tell someone something and they just don't get it. And it's a huge bummer. And you miss out on that sense of relief that comes from really feeling heard. All right. You might be trying to not assume, asking questions, but asking those open-ended, non-assuming questions can be really hard, especially if you're trying to think of them while you're simultaneously processing what a student is saying to you. So tip number two, if you feel tongue-tied, try mirroring back to a student what they're saying to you. So a student might tell you they're really struggling with their mental health and they're feeling super guilty about turning in their work late. You might say something like, what I'm hearing is that you're having a really hard time because of something many people are going through, mental health struggles. You're worried about submitting work late. Can we figure out a compromise for your work in this class? Right? That has the bonus of validating them as well. And then finally, if you're feeling like your own emotions are really distracting you from the conversation, you can try what I like to call the clothesline technique. So in the clothesline, you acknowledge your emotion as it comes up, and then you imagine it on a piece of fabric, you hang it up, and you move it out of the way so that you can keep listening. For example, you might be meeting with a student who's telling you about doing all their schoolwork in a car outside Starbucks because their internet at home isn't strong enough. That might break your heart. I know that it would break mine. but your broken heart isn't actually going to help the conversation. So in the clothesline technique, you can imagine your broken heart on a piece of cloth, hang it up, and move it out of the way so that you can keep listening to the student. Maybe at the end of the conversation, you can ask the student if they want to be pointed towards UCSD's IT resources. But the point of the clothesline technique, again, is to remember that you feeling bad is not going to help your student feel better. But having someone acknowledge what they're going through is terrible might, right? Chances are your student doesn't want you to sign off and cry. They just want someone to say that absolutely sucks, I'm sorry, and I'll do what I can to accommodate you within this class. Whew. Okay. So that was a lot. Feel free to take a deep breath. So we've covered some tips about how you can listen to a student and help them feel heard. But I also want to emphasize that most discussions are not exclusively about one thing or the other, right? Often when a student comes to talk to you, their intention is to talk about how they're doing in the course, but they end up talking about something else because it's really at the forefront of their mind, right? So most discussions are kind of not exclusively about the course or exclusively about being in distress. They're usually somewhere in the middle, which is why I have this spectrum on the slide, right? So you can actually think of a student's distress as an object that might get in the way of them talking about what they intended to talk to you about. And then you can recognize that they might need to get it out of the way before you can talk to them about the course or the program or their research. In other words, providing the sense of relief that comes with feeling heard and understood might actually make room for students to talk about their academics, right? Your validation can be a really important part of their learning. So if you know this, right, if you think that your students might need to get whatever is going on with them out of the way before they can talk to you about their work, you can actually anticipate that, accommodate it by making your appointments a little longer and letting your students talk through whatever it is they need to talk through first. And I also want to point out, this applies to you too, right? Distress can get in the way of having the conversation you want. It can also get in the way of being the kind of listener you want to be, right? Your own distress, whatever you're feeling, whatever you're thinking, can be an obstacle. And so another piece of advice is for you to find your own buddy, which I like to call a clearing buddy, right? Someone you can check in with before you go into office hours or before you go into a meeting that you've scheduled with a student to talk about whatever they're going through. Literally talk to your clearing buddy so that you can clear your listening field or clear the space that you have in order to listen to students. And then because you're buddies, they get to do that with you too. And I just I'm going to say this many more times, but if you set up a meeting with a student and they come in and they tell you that they're having a mental health crisis, that is beyond what you can handle in your role, right? So these are tips for really things before that boundary of being a therapist or giving medical advice. Right? So listening is a skill, as hopefully you have gotten the sense of, and it's a skill that's most often cultivated by clinicians, mental health professionals, doctors, and that's not us, right? Office hours aren't therapy. And there are two key differences between what we can do and what a mental health provider can do. One, your listening can provide temporary relief to a student, ideally in the service of learning. But again, you cannot fix their problems. And two, you can accommodate students within your course, maybe point them towards university resources. That's basically your purview. You cannot be responsible for other realms of your student's life or well-being. Those are the two key differences between us, clinicians. We can't provide ongoing support, and we cannot be responsible. So if you find yourself getting overwhelmed, if you find yourself kind of approaching that boundary, here are a few things you can do. One, you can say no, full stop, for whatever reason. It's not ideal, it might be awkward, but again, your students need you to be whole and as functional as you can be. Two, you can set time limits for meetings with students and then let them know ahead of time. I know that that might sound a little bit contradictory to what I said about clearing, but it might be the difference between, ordinarily having 20-minute office hour sessions and in this case, scheduling 30-minute office hour sessions. And then letting your students know ahead of time, right when they come in, we have 30 minutes. I'm going to have to sign off at the end of 30 minutes. And then as you get towards the end of the meeting, reinforce that boundary with them. It's way easier to set it up and then enforce it than it is to be like, oh, we're 25 minutes in and I really have to go and you're in the middle of something like really intense and I feel awful, right? So set your boundary early, let your students know ahead of time so that they know how long they have to actually talk to you about things. All right, number 3, bring someone else into the situation, right? This might mean you need to rope in the department chair. It might mean you need to call CAPS and say like, hey, can I have a consultation about how to talk to the student because I feel like really out of my depth. Bring someone else in. You don't have to do it alone. With the major caveat that you should let your student know that you're going to do this. So something that actually happened to me was like I had a conversation that I thought was confidential, and then the person who I was talking to went and actually, this is when I was an undergrad, told my dean all about it, which started this like whole terrible chain that ended with like my professors being like, hey, the dean said that like maybe you're going to drop out of school. And I was like, who, what? What? And that was terrible. It was a horrible surprise. So I encourage you to just let your student know, hey, this conversation was really intense. I'm not really sure what I can do for you. I'm going to call CAPS and just talk to them, see what they recommend, and then I'll get back to you, right? Be open, be transparent. And finally, you've heard this a couple times, but do what you're doing in community and not alone. Coming to this workshop is a really good start. So that means you can find out who in your department is responsible for what. Make yourself a list. This is who I should email if this situation is going on. This is what the chair wants to hear about. This is what the undergraduate coordinator can do, right? These are the 6 hubs in the Teaching and Learning Commons, and here's the services that they all offer. You can think about who in your department is doing the most like supporting of students. Sorry, that was an awkward way of saying this, but think about, are you taking on that burden disproportionately? Can you ask some of your colleagues who maybe don't have as many students going to them, hey, like I would really appreciate it if you let students know that your office hours are available to them too, because they seem to only be coming to mine. And vice versa, right? If you're someone who doesn't talk to a lot of students, ask your colleagues, hey, how many students are coming to your office hours? And are you just doing something that I'm not doing that I could be doing? And in addition to that, I hope that you can take the things that I've talked about in this workshop, that listening is a skill, that it's something that can be done in support of learning and therefore really can fall into our role as educators, and let everyone know this is part of our role as educators, right? If everyone has that awareness, then hopefully we can distribute the effort that it takes to really do all this listening a little bit more evenly. And then something that I didn't mention so far, but is also really great, is that you can think about creating opportunities for your students to support each other. So we often talk about, getting to know your students, doing a survey, letting your students get to know you. But actually, students are really great at advocating for one another. So you can think about ways to incorporate that into your class as well, right? You can put them in paired breakout rooms, let them talk to each other about what's going on. And then when you call everyone back, say something like, what can I do to support your classmates? And then they don't have to tell you like, hey, I'm going through this super terrible thing. They can say, hey, I heard that someone is going through this thing and that they said it would be really great if you did this other thing, right? So these are all ways to kind of think about, again, how to preserve yourself when you're doing this very intense emotional work.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing so many really thought-provoking. Every time I hear these strategies, I still am like, wow, that is the framing and consideration of our role and our normal role as experts and our role as listeners. It's always so wonderful. So thank you, Rachel, for sharing that. I did want to wrap up with just, as Rachel was talking about, setting boundaries with your students is a really important way to maintain your own well-being and make sure that you're doing your work with your students and your classes in a way that is sustainable for you and healthy for you. And I also just wanted to share a few more practices kind of outside of what you're doing in your course and with your students that can help support your just mental and emotional health that will allow you to be sustained in your work, in all of your different roles, not only teaching, but all the different roles that you have. And so one we've talked about a number of times, but I will reiterate it one more time, is just the importance of community for support and for shared processing. I also wanted to share one really great strategy for debriefing. It's called low impact debriefing. And this is something that Rachel mentioned earlier, the importance of having like a clearing buddy or someone who you can turn to kind of share and process and release what's going on in your work. And low impact debriefing is a really great way to do that in a way that doesn't add to the emotional difficulty or trauma of what's going on. And so I won't go through all of the details in this moment. We have a link here. So if this is something that interests you, you are welcome to explore it further. But the idea is basically, making sure that you're getting consent when you're going to share with someone about something that's really difficult or something that you heard or are experiencing. Starting by expressing that what you're describing might be triggering or difficult, getting that person's consent, and then thinking carefully about what you're disclosing so that what you're sharing is exactly what you need to share in order to feel the release and the relief of being heard and not more, right? So sometimes we end up sharing all sorts of details that are really, feel very affecting, but the act of raising those again and hearing them and sharing them with someone else can actually kind of stress us out more, right? And so just being mindful about what we're disclosing in order to really be in service of getting that relief. Sometimes it's enough to just say, I am so sad, right? Sometimes that's enough. And when it's not, but being mindful of that. Another thing that can be really helpful, and I know that it's strange in the era of, virtual work and, we're not necessarily working in a workplace or going home at the end of the day, but something like an end of work day ritual, which might actually look more like, setting aside times in your day, scheduled times that you are committing to focusing on your class. Here is when I'm going to answer emails, or here is, I'm going to do office hours, and having those bracketed off spaces in your day. And then when that time ends, having some sort of ritual that signals to your nervous system, signals to your body that now we're stepping away from that, right? Now we're putting that down and doing something else. And so that might be changing your clothes, having a cup of tea, lighting a candle, whatever it is that kind of signals to you that you're stepping out of that in order to, again, kind of try to reduce the amount of ongoing thinking and stress, right? Sometimes we need to put things down. So this is something that can help with that. Self-awareness and mindfulness practice can be really, really beneficial. We've talked a couple times today about kind of, noticing your feelings, noticing the reactions that are coming up, and being able to handle those things in a mindful way. Like, for instance, the clothesline technique that Rachel shared with us. And so thinking about mindfulness, maybe, if you have a mindfulness practice, that's wonderful. If you don't, maybe seeing if it works for you, right? Trying something out and seeing if it might be something that would be helpful for you. And we'll share with you some resources that are available to UCSD staff, students, and faculty for some mindfulness practice. And then kind of, consistent with everything that we're talking about, just really recognizing the importance of rest and of recharging and of having joy in your life, right? And I know that teaching, we're passionate about teaching. When we have a class, it is so important to us, and our students are so important to us. And it's something that, we can sometimes find ourselves working on nights and weekends, and, every waking moment we're kind of dedicating it to our courses. And, I understand and I share that inclination, but at the same time, it's important to recognize, we need to be resting, we need to be recharged. And as Rachel mentioned earlier, our students want us to be healthy, and they want us to show up as a whole complete person, right? And so trying to do the things that bring you joy in your life and prioritize those and don't feel guilty about it, it's important. And then finally, seek support when you need it. And we've talked a bit about this today already, but one thing that I wanted to mention in particular in regards to support is that we at the Engage Teaching Hub support you. You'll see a link here when you get this to request a consultation. We would love to meet with you. We have a team of really wonderful graduate teaching consultants and education specialists. And I wanted to make sure to emphasize that, sometimes folks think like I need a teaching question. So it needs to be a question about my syllabus or a test that I'm designing. And those things are great to talk about. We would love to talk to you about those, but also thinking about accommodations, right? If you are faced with a situation in which a student is requesting accommodations or has a major thing going on and you're not sure how to handle it or what to do, we can absolutely help you and talk through that and bounce ideas around and be there for you with things like that as well, right? So just want to mention that so that you know that we are here for you and want to support you in the work that you are doing to support your students. And then finally, just for general resources to support your teaching, the Keep Teaching webpage has all sorts of things, really wonderful resources that can be valuable to you, including more documentation and resources specifically about how to support students.